panel here, 5 authors. I've already mentioned Kristian Niemietz. We also have Chris Goulden, the head of the poverty team at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We've got Baron Glasman of Stoke, Newington and Stamford Hill, who's Senior Lecturer in Political Theory at London Guildhall University, and the author of the so-called Blue Labour set of ideas, which have caused quite a stir in the Labour Party and elsewhere. Janet Daley, a regular columnist from the Sunday Telegraph and long-standing friend of the IEA, and our own Professor Philip Booth, the editorial director here at the IEA. So the way we're going to work is that all of the panel, with one exception, are going to have between 5 and 7 minutes each. The exception being Kristian, and since he's the author, he's going to be allowed about 10 to 12. I am going to be quite stern and enforce the time limits, so put people on notice right now that I'll do that. The order we're going to go in is that Kristian is going to kick us off, then we're going to have Chris Goulden, then Janet Daley, then Lord Glasman, and then finally Philip Booth will wind up. After that there will be Q&A, and we will look to finish pretty soon around 8 o'clock. That's partly because both Chris and myself have to catch trains later on this evening to the civilised parts of the United Kingdom, further north of here, and so I think it's only appropriate that Chris, certainly anyway, should be able to have a drink along with the rest of you in the reception that we'll have afterwards. So without any further more ado, I'll hand over to Kristian to do the first presentation.
Thank you, Steve. Well, the poverty debate is normally framed in terms of a narrative about different economic models. The conventional narrative that we're all familiar with is this one here, of course, which essentially says nations can choose between an Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism, which is supposed to be characterized by minimalistic levels of welfare spending and which accepts high levels of relative poverty, and on the other hand, the Nordic model or the Scandinavian model of social democracy, which is supposed to be characterized by extensive welfare provision and low levels of relative poverty. Now there are a number of problems with narratives of this kind, and one of them is that they become self-perpetuating. They still stay around even when they are no longer applicable, and that is exactly what has happened in this case. There's an easy way of showing how. This shows social expenditure in the Nordic countries as a proportion of the size of their economies. We can see they spend between just under a fifth and just over a quarter of their GDPs on social purposes, which is a lot. So it is true, definitely, that Nordic welfare states are very comprehensive, but the UK, in those terms, is very much in the same league with these countries. So social expenditure here accounts for about 23% of GDP. That would be a perfectly normal figure for a Scandinavian country as well. So there are certainly no major differences on that count. We can also look more specifically at family benefits, because that is what a big part of the poverty debate has been about. This is about things like childcare subsidies and child benefit, child tax credit, and so on. And on those terms, the UK has actually overtaken the Nordic countries already. So on that count at least, the UK is more Nordic than the Nordics already. And just to give an impression of what this means in practice, here we can see the composition of household incomes at different points of the income distribution. The blue part here shows income received from the state in the form of income transfers, and the red part shows income earned on the market in the form of wages or investment, or in this case contributory pensions, also counted as market income. We can see in the bottom quintile, the poorest 20% of the population. There, the government is already the major income provider, accounts for more than half of total income. that in itself is unsurprising, but we can also see in the second quintile, even there, state transfers account for more than 40% of total income. And even in the middle quintile, the 20% in the middle of the income distribution, even there, government transfers account for about a quarter of total incomes. And it's worth bearing in mind that this is actually an understatement because this is based on income surveys, and it's well known that transfer income is always underreported in income surveys. People don't report all the income that they receive in the form of state benefits. So the actual figures, if that could be corrected, would be even higher. So that means if Nordic model means a model in which the majority of the population receives a big share of their income from state transfers, if it means that transfer spending accounts for a big slice of GDP, then the Nordic model is already here. There is no big difference in those terms between the UK and the Scandinavian countries. That is simply a myth. But unfortunately, I mean, we can disagree about whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. I won't go into that debate today. All I'm saying is that we should recognize at least that this is now the status quo. We should not engage in some mythology here. And unfortunately, the social policy debate is quite often driven by mythology and outdated narratives. Here, this quote from Polly Toynbee is a good illustration. It says nations can choose to be high tax, high social service, high social solidarity nations, like the Nordics, or they can choose to be the devil take the hindmost US, and Britain is heading down the American path. Or here, Child Poverty Action Group claims there is a political consensus around reducing child poverty and public support for meeting the targets. The next step is for government to mobilize the resources. That shouldn't surprise us very much. There is no conceivable level of public spending at which Polly Toynbee or the Child Poverty Action Group would say that is enough. With that, we are content. That just doesn't exist. But that shouldn't stop the rest of us from recognizing that that approach has been taken very far. Whatever we make of it, whether we think it's good or bad, but it has been taken as far as it gets, and now we should think about alternatives. And that is what I'm trying to do in this book here, because I think there is a fairly obvious alternative. Because there is an elephant in the room of the poverty debate. And that is simply the fact that the basic cost of living in this country is extremely high by way of international comparisons. Now, I'm not saying that Britain is in general an expensive place to live, because that is clearly not true. I'm not talking about aggregate cost levels, because there are product market sectors here which are remarkably competitive, and that is reflected in consumer prices. What I'm saying is that the cost of the basic essentials is extremely high and much higher than in comparable countries, at least. Housing costs, for example, are probably the highest in the world here. This is the house price index adjusted for inflation. Over the last 4 decades, we can see house prices have increased 3.5-fold. That's a very unusual development in international comparisons. There are comparable countries where house prices today are still at the same level as they were in the 1970s, where house prices have only gone up in line with inflation. So this is a very unusual profile. prices here are among the highest in Western Europe at least, possibly beyond. Here we can see the same for childcare costs and so on. So this is a pattern that reappears over a number of sectors in varying degrees. And the fact that this reappears, the fact that this is so unusual in international comparisons, suggests strongly that this is not inevitable. Right? We're not talking about goods and services here which are intrinsically expensive. We're talking about goods and services which are being made expensive by misguided policies, and misguided policies can be reversed. And I'm suggesting that that should be the starting point of an alternative poverty agenda. We should try to identify those cost inflators and remove them. That should be the starting point of a more rational anti-poverty policy. I won't tell you what that means in detail because I still want you to buy the book after this presentation. But let me just say I've got a back of the envelope simplified calculation at the end here showing that under quite realistic assumptions, living costs for a family of four could be cut in an order of magnitude of something like £750 per month. And that is not an optimistic account at all. Now finally, there are at least three reasons why such a strategy would be superior to the strategy that we've had over the past years and that we still have at the moment. The first one is simply the issue of cost effectiveness. As long as we have this regressive cost structure, it's just not a smart policy to pump more resources into the transfer machinery. That is essentially like turning up the heatings to full power while all the windows are wide open. So focusing on the living cost issue, on the supply side issue, is simply a more cost-effective approach. Secondly, there's also the issue of poverty traps. High living costs create poverty traps because their side effect is that more and more people rely on means-tested benefits to supplement incomes. For example, housing benefit is pegged to rent levels. The childcare element of working tax credit is pegged to childcare costs, and so on. So if the cost of these goods keeps increasing, then that means more people rely on income supplements and they have to be withdrawn at some point. They are counted, the income is counted against these benefits, and this is what creates these extremely high effective or implicit marginal tax rates of 70% and over. And finally, there is the issue of political independence. As long as such a large proportion of the population depends on government transfers for such a big slice of the income, their living standards will always be a political football. So these are the reasons why I think we need a different approach to tackling poverty. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Chris Goulden from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I think I'm here as the acceptable face of the poverty lobby. Troy Toynbee and CPAG around Kristian's calls at the moment.
Not yet.
Well, I was a big fan of Kristian's first book on poverty. So when this one was published, I made sure that the JRF library ordered one straight away. And it was a great pleasure to be asked to appear on the panel tonight to talk about the issues that it raises. I just want to cover a few points in my response where I agree with Kristian, what JRF is doing about the cost of living and research into that, where I disagree and how I think we might move forward. So both of Kristian's books on poverty have had a big influence on our thinking at Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Although we've never been income fundamentalists and have always looked at many measures of poverty and disadvantage, the impact of the very high cost of living for people in poverty had not received the attention it deserved. So we take the main message from the book very seriously. Costs are as important as incomes in determining poverty and providing solutions. In fact, every year since 2008, we've published analysis of what we call the minimum income standard, or MIS for short, or misnomer as Kristian refers to it, but maybe we can talk about that later. MIS is based on what the public think we all need for an acceptable standard of living. This list includes food, clothes, bills and housing costs, but also some social participation like birthday presents or swimming lessons. The goods and services in this basket are then categorised and costed in order to come up with the standard for different family types. These are calculated net of taxes and benefits as well as in terms of the gross wage that you need to meet the standard. This research tells us four basic things. The rate of inflation at the minimum has been rising much faster than in general. Cuts to in-work benefits in particular have made reaching the standard much harder in the last few years, especially for working parents. Reductions in the quality and availability of public services can lead to switching to pricier private alternatives. Buses were in the original standard in 2008, but were replaced with a second-hand car for parents in the most recent update. So combined with meagre rises in earnings and benefits, this all means that the number falling below the standard has risen sharply in a very short space of time. So the work we've done and the analysis in Kristian's book opens up a new front on poverty. In theory, the number of people living below our standard could be lowered by reducing the costs of these basic goods and not touching incomes at all. Kristian himself puts forward two broad sets of solutions in response to the problem of high costs. And I won't give away too much and spoil his sales. But the two themes are around deregulation and localisation. But I worry that these are as dogmatic and ideological as the views of those from the poverty and climate lobbies who are castigated in the book. Some deregulation in particular areas would seem to be helpful, however. The example of housing is a good one. And localisation of welfare policy, as is happening now in Northern Ireland, can also provide solutions. Here in Northern Ireland, we're seeing a tailored response to welfare reform, with claimants being given the choice about how frequently they receive their benefits under universal credit, instead of being forced to operate under a monthly system. But deregulation and localisation are not the answers to every problem of social and economic policy. You only have to consider recent events to wonder what further deregulation within food supply chains might mean for consumer health, as well as the conditions for those working in them. Localisation of council tax benefit and the social fund are not so far leading to innovative approaches from councils. For the social fund, all councils have removed the loan parts in favour of grants. This is a backward step. The choice is being made by councils on council tax support from April, but likely to be hitting working age, working claimants moments the hardest. It's also a shame that the book is written at times in an antagonistic manner towards the poverty lobby. There is much that they can learn from switching the focus from income to costs. We are taking this criticism on board. JRF has begun a major new programme to develop anti-poverty strategies for each UK nation. We're starting from a definition of poverty that is having inadequate resources to meet basic needs. This implies costs are as important as incomes in reaching a UK with lower poverty. So Kristian's book is a vital reminder that we must focus more on reducing the cost of living in order to have sustainable solutions to poverty. Thank you.
I'm very interested in the title, Redefining the Poverty Debate, because it seems to me that, if you'll forgive me, one of the hidden premises in this whole argument is that poverty itself has been redefined in a very drastic and consequential way for political life. Part of that redefinition comes about through a new political settlement, a new political consensus that arose about 3/4 of the way through the last century. Those of you who are old enough to remember, or even if you don't, if you've learnt your modern history, will know that most of the last century was dominated by the political argument between socialism and capitalism. Those were the alternatives in most European societies, and this one as well. This reached a kind of apotheosis in the 1970s and 1980s when the argument became very hard-headed and very bloody, and it was thought that it didn't really end, or one of the causes of its ending was the reinvention of the Labour Party to be not a post-Marxist, sort of social democratic party. And that this happened in much of Western Europe, that there was a kind of general move away from Marxist left-wing parties, and that this was not unconnected to the end of the Cold War. As it were, capitalism won the argument, and everybody believed in free markets. But the left, parties of the left, believed in free markets as a way of paying for a kind of soft socialism, democratic socialism. So the idea was that you could have socialism and capitalism at the same time, and that the free market economy would provide the funds and the revenue for the kind of socialist society that is wealth redistributing and the alleviation of poverty. And this is where my argument about the change in the definition of poverty comes in. With the end of the Cold War, what the West seemed to take, the lesson that it seemed to take from its defeat of the East, was that it had to accept the model of the state as a social engineer, as a wealth redistribution, as an imposing of social equality kind of machine, in order to avert any future threat to freedom. In other words, the way you countered the danger of totalitarian socialism was to have a social democratic and therefore a kind of social equality that would be instigated by government, which would be seen as the fount of social fairness and social justice. Social justice, the term that New Labour used a great deal, or social fairness. So the original capitalism could only be tolerated, in other words, if government distributed its wealth evenly across the society. The original concept of social security and welfare provision, which had come with the post-war settlement, the post-war welfare state, was that no one should be allowed to sink into actual destitution or real want, and want was the word that Beveridge used specifically. But that had to be revisited now. The new ideal was that there should not be inequalities of wealth. It wasn't just a question of absolute poverty any longer, it was relative poverty that had to be abolished. The roaring success of the free market created such unprecedented levels of mass prosperity that absolute poverty became virtually extinct in Western democracies. So it had to be replaced as a social evil by relative poverty, which not only represented neediness on the part of those who you would now define as poor, but a kind of moral iniquity on the part of those who were wealthier. It wasn't just unfair that some people had more money than others, it was inherently evil. That was a social evil in and of itself. It wasn't enough that no one should be genuinely poor, hungry, and without basic necessities. What was demanded now was that no one should be made much worse or better off than anyone else. The job of government was to create a society in which there were no significant disparities in earnings or standards of living. So this is what you see in the Polly Toynbee School of Left-Wing Journalism, as it were, that it's inherently evil that anybody be much better off than anybody else, even if the anybody else isn't actually poor, even if everybody's living standards are improving. So it wasn't just the unemployed who were given assistance. The low-paid had their wages supplemented by working tax credits or in-work benefits so that their earnings could be brought up to the arbitrary level which the state had decided would constitute not poverty. The paradoxical effect of this is that the only politically acceptable condition is to be earning just enough to maintain independent life and not a penny more. Everybody is steered by the penalties of the tax system or the gradual withdrawal of benefits into that small space in the middle between being rich, which is to say at the moment defined as earning over about £40,000 a year, and being relatively poor. As detailed analysis has made clear, the only group that's been spared by, for example, the present government's tinkering with tax and benefit policies is a standard rate taxpayers. They're the kind of ideal. They're neither rich nor unemployed. They're paragons. They're perfect exemplars of fairness, surviving on an income which makes life just about bearable, but remaining careful always not to allow their aspirations to propel them beyond their station and into unacceptable earnings levels. This picture of the perfectly equitable society in which disparities of wealth are eradicated and economic equality is maintained through a vastly complex and expensive system of state intervention has been the explicit goal of the European Union virtually since its inception. It's had an on-again, off-again history in Britain until it was locked firmly into the political infrastructure by Gordon Brown. More unexpectedly, it's now taken root in the American political culture. But the problem, the really critical problem, is that capitalism is by its nature dynamic. It creates transitory disparities of wealth constantly as it reinvents itself. Fortunes are made and lost, old industries are replaced by new, the earnings that they create rise and fall, punishing those who exceed some momentary average income and artificially subsidizing those who temporarily fall below it, as well as providing for a universal standard of living which bears no relation to merit or even to need, has now reached the unavoidable, unaffordable end of the line, that it is simply not possible for a free market economy to produce enough wealth to support the enormous entitlements program and the enormous social equality programs which are designed to even out any possible disparities of wealth. So in effect, the cash cow, the milch cow, has to be killed off by disincentives and punitive levels of taxation in order to finance a system which is interventionist in a way that actually prohibits not just disparities of wealth, but the creation of new wealth, which means that it constantly redistributes existing resources and prints money eventually in order to escape from the trap of having eliminated the possibility of economic growth.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's good to be here. I don't usually accept invitations these days, except from Catholic Church, of course, because Catholic social thought and Catholic political economy offers an alternative to state market conversations, which I think is an extremely important inheritance. But I also wanted to come to the IEA, first of all, to express my respect for the political work you did, probably more 30 years ago than now, but still that was extremely effective work, and because you championed Hayek, and I think Hayek still remains probably the most important political or economic thinker in terms of how we're going to get out of the present very distressing market state blockage that we have, where one side completely blames the state for undermining creativity, innovation, as you just did, and the other side completely blames the market for the distressing levels of inequality and lack of access to things, and in some way discover the social. But the problem, the reason why Hayek is important and very important for poverty, and I do also wish to express my great respect for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation over many years, not least because you funded my masters at York in theory, so thank you for that. I never did write the thank you note because I was less polite in those days. The issue with Hayek is that in his social theory he made a very important sort of almost not a trinity maybe, but a trilogy of concepts between instinct, rationality and tradition, in which tradition mediated between instinct and rationality. Now, effectively, he identified instinct with sort of some ugly communitarian nativistic desire to hate strangers and people who don't look like you. And he viewed rationality as essentially self-defeating in the same way that capitalism can be, in that it begins to eat the very virtues and values that led to its sustenance. And tradition mediated between rationality and instinct. And that's his explanation for the actual superiority of the Anglo-Saxon Kristian, the Anglo-Saxon school, was that it allowed tradition to continue in its educational system, in its legal system, through common law, through the universities, and through the monarchy as well, allowed tradition to continue to mediate between these two demands of atavistic solidarity and rationalistic self-interest. So it's very important that Hayek was not a neoclassical economic theorist. He didn't believe in rational clearing markets or any of that. However, in his economic theory there was a problem. And the problem was that he didn't sort of import his social theory into his economic theory. And in his economic theory there was just the state and the market, in which the state effectively, if it moved beyond the legal system and upholding a legal system, effectively violated the dynamic market system and the correct allocation of resources according to the price system. Now, what we're trying to do in Blue Labour and what we're trying to do, I think, in the Labour Party at the moment is to actually think about what are the traditions, what are the institutions that underpin value, that we view, if you read John Cruddas' speeches of the last couple of weeks, we view the problem that we have in our country as way beyond an economic problem. It's a problem relating to value, to the generation of value. It's a problem of demoralisation, and it's a problem of debt. And it's very important to see that the debt started really, the substitution of debt for value really started under Margaret Thatcher, but definitely intensified under New Labour. Yeah, and so when I first got the invitation, I was slightly stung by this idea of the welfare. What do you call them? The welfare industry, the poverty industry. As if that was entirely identified with the state, that it didn't include Wonga and the money shop and various other predatory and usurious institutions that prey upon the misfortunes of the poor. As if the allocation, the dependency that you speak of, which is usually not a dependency, it's almost entirely an isolation and a lack of relationship and a lack of connection and a lack of connection to virtuous civic institutions, was not simply a state matter, although it is. It's also a market matter. And that if you look at the depletion, there's not a single mutual, there's not a single building society, there's not a single regional bank that still exists as an autonomous entity since demutualisation or privatisation. That there's been a complete denuding of financial institutions that serve local places. I think the story of Northern Rock is a good one, founded in 1850 as the Northern Counties Permanent Building Society, survived and flourished through 4 Great Depressions and grew and served the area, merged with the Rock Building Society in the 60s and still remained one of the most trusted institution of the North East in financial terms, but it was demutualised in 1997 and became Northern Rock, sponsored Newcastle United among other things, and it didn't even survive the length of the New Labour government. It became entirely bankrupt, overextended. In other words, the maximisation of returns, the pursuit of the maximisation of returns led to the destruction of the original asset. But there were no constraints on capital. So in the same way as that there's an avariciousness in the state, which is to centralise, atomise, administrate, destroy human relationships, so that exists as well in the pressures of the market. And I think that it's important that we have a balance here. So I realise I'm running out of time. It's a very interesting conversation. Just 3 things to Kristian in terms of where I really agree. In terms of, first of all, housing and looking at the endowment of land to community land trusts. There's obviously, I noticed that Anthony Selsdon last week, son of Arthur Selsdon, called for Ed Balls notice that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. But it's very important, I think, that Labour actually pursues a very constructive thing of land reform, of the redistribution of land, which halves the freehold price, so that there can be some house building, and so not resisting the cuts, but resisting the privatisation and selling off of land. I think that's a very important thing. And the organisation of local people for housing that they can afford. I think the issue in relation to childcare is all part of the relational welfare agenda that's moving forward. How do we support networks of care? How do we support grandparents who look after their children? How can we do that? And also the establishment of regional banks, so that there isn't this concentration of monopoly, of the incredible concentration of capital in the City of London. Obviously that should be complemented by the extension of the City of London and the Corporation of the City of London to all of London, so that all of London are the inheritors of the great inheritance of freedom and liberty of the city, and not simply the financial sector. It's an incredible thing that the IEA has never raised this issue. Imagine in Sheffield if the trade unions were exclusively represented in the City Council and the Territorial Authority. People would think that was a bit communist, I think, Janet. But the idea that capital has an exclusive representation in the most ancient and the wealthiest civic institution in the land, it really is against your principles, and you should make a bit of noise about it. And also in terms of establishing regional banks, there's an initiative at the moment in Salford, an alliance between the credit unions, the unions and the local authority to set up a bank that only lends in Salford. What we have is this astonishing concentration of capital in the City of London, aided and abetted, of course, by the lobbying system that they have through the Corporation of the City of London, and we need to break that in order to unleash the energies of people, which is absolutely necessary to engage with poverty. Poverty can only really be dealt with through recognising relational poverty, that people, your determinants of getting a job are determined overwhelmingly by whether your friends have got jobs. That's where the data comes in. So we need to address issues of relational poverty, access to credit, vocational education, regional banks, community land trusts. So not statist programs of social engineering, Janet, but a general reconstitution of the civic institutions of the society that can be a constraint on the market as well as the state, and give people a basic dignity and value in their lives.
Well, let me begin perhaps by just making a couple of remarks about the previous contributions, just so I'm not sort of repeating what Kristian has already said. First of all, I must say I enjoyed debating these sorts of issues with Morris, as he suggested at the beginning of his remarks. And I agree with him that these problems of relationships, the degrading of communities and community institutions and so on is extremely important when we're thinking about this issue of poverty. It just happens not to be the particular issue that was at the subject of the monograph, because it wasn't the research. It wasn't the research project that Kristian was working on, but it is an important issue. But we do have to have a serious debate about how we bring about such reform, because the evidence is quite clear that the mutual building society, insurance industry and so on, ground to a halt as soon as these industries were, or rather as soon as their counterparts, the proprietary industries, the shareholder-owned companies, the big companies, were regulated by the state, because there then became no relative advantage of, for example, leaving your deposits with a building society which had held more capital and so on, because your deposits were insured and regulated by the state, and the same was the case in the mutual insurance industry too. And then, so keeping these organisations as they were, as mutuals, rooted in the community and so on, became like pushing water uphill. It became extremely difficult once the state took over that regulatory role. And I think that's a challenge actually for the Labour Party, and we can discuss it maybe in the Q&A. Let me begin by addressing the point that Chris made with an anecdote. I think he suggested that Kristian was perhaps unfair at the beginning of his monograph, although he did identify quite carefully the groups that he wanted to attack when Kristian was talking about the poverty lobby, and quite specifically didn't include the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So let me just begin with an anecdote. On the day that the monograph was published, I wrote an article for Con Home, which was particularly looking at the first couple of chapters in Kristian's monograph and how the poverty lobby talked about nothing else other than increasing welfare benefits, and why was this the case, and why did they have so many people working in advocacy rather than in their charitable activities and so on. And this article rather annoyed the poverty lobby somewhat, and the Child Poverty Action Group wrote to the editor of Con Home, Tim Montgomery, and asked if they could have a right of reply. And Tim Montgomery kindly agreed. A couple of days later, Con Home said, "Do you mind waiting a week or so for the for our reply, because we're all busy working on the welfare bill at the moment." And I think that's an indication of the problem that we face. So many of these organisations are extraordinarily well staffed with researchers who are working in order to promote a system of poverty relief which is essentially bust. They criticise programmes which are welfare programmes which are tied to work. They talk incessantly about redistribution through increased benefits, and they call continually for increases in housing benefits. But when it comes, surely, to these tools, the toolkit is exhaustive. The government is already spending 50% of national income. What proportion of national income does the government have to spend before these problems are solved through the mechanism of welfare transfers? Means-tested benefits are already provided to families with children on 150% of median incomes. This cannot plausibly be increased. Over 2/3 of families with children receive a means-tested benefit. And the problem is you can't increase benefits at the bottom without either increasing the rate at which benefits are removed, or by dragging more people into the means testing net. As Kristian said, our welfare state already redistributes to the same extent as the Swedish welfare state. The top 1% of income earners pay already over 1/4 of income tax. It's difficult to see how the income tax system, at least, can be made more progressive without raising less revenue. Housing benefit has now reached £23 billion, and it's quite clear that the only effect of further increases in housing benefit is to inflate demand for housing and therefore inflate its price as long as the supply remains static. The other area which Kristian didn't talk about very much, where I think the poverty lobby really does distort the debate, is perhaps even more worrying. As Kristian shows us in the monograph, the poverty lobby takes every opportunity to remind us that, or to try to persuade us, that work is not a way out of poverty, and to remind us that half of all poor children live with a working parent. The reality actually is very different if you unpack the figures as Kristian has done. Only 2% of all children living with two parents, where one of those parents works full-time and the other works part-time, live in poverty. The fact is that we have a benefit system that encourages people to work exactly 16 hours a week. And that is exactly what 55% of single parents and 25% of couple parents do. The poverty lobby, it seems, derides work because people cannot work their way out of poverty on a 2-day week. As it happens, our benefit system, in fact, produces exactly the sort of outcomes that you would expect, aside from this issue of everybody, or so many people, working for exactly 16 hours a week. We have extraordinarily low levels of marriage amongst couples with children on low earnings. We have the highest proportion of children in workless households in the European Union, the lowest proportion of single parents working in Europe, and a polarisation such that families have either two parents working very long hours or nobody working at all. That's a bit of an exaggeration of the situation, but it's a characteristic which is distinctive of the situation in the UK. Indeed, we have a welfare system which strongly discourages those activities which lead people out of poverty. And Beveridge would be turning in his grave to see the situation that we have today. To Beveridge, benefits were a temporary or an exceptional measure. Beveridge would never have predicted that the welfare state could have reached the juncture where it was not possible for indeed a family with just a single earner to actually provide the basics for that family. Housing, energy, food, other basic needs, and so on. He would not have believed that a family, even with a single earner, earning less than median earnings, would actually have needed benefits from the state, except in the form of child tax allowances. So what has gone wrong? And here I want to sum up and reiterate some of what Kristian has said, perhaps emphasising different aspects. Today, median house prices are well over 5 times median incomes, perhaps twice as expensive as they need to be. Rents, of course, follow house prices. Our childcare, as Kristian said, is the most expensive in Europe, and our food is also the most expensive in Europe and 30% more expensive than Ireland's. In the case of food and childcare, there are other ways in which the government raises the cost of living, and Kristian specifically mentions the common agricultural policy, which unfortunately is out with the control of the British government. But in all 3 cases here, the finger points quite clearly at the planning system. The planning system raises the cost of housing, quite obviously. It also raises the cost of food by restricting competition and preventing the sort of modern innovations in